giving a voice to silent victims and bringing war criminals to justice. We'll examine global efforts to tackle sexual violence in conflict. I'm Martin Stanford. This is Insight. Welcome to Insight. The United Nations Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon has said that sexual violence in conflict represents the world's greatest failure to protect civilians. Attacks are frequently carried out by both sides in a war, and sometimes even by the peacekeepers sent to protect the vulnerable. Despite global initiatives to tackle it, experts say little has changed. Insight's Yasmin Hassan-Diwan reports.
Habiba Musammat's chilling story of war in Myanmar is all too shockingly common. Horrific accounts of sexual violence have been reported in conflict zones spanning the globe and exist not only in our history books, but are taking place right now. Sexual violence isn't a product of conflict, it's a weapon of war.
Mass violence, mass rape, and so forth have been used as a way not only of persecuting a population, but also really destabilizing communities and families.
Accounts of sexual abuse are notoriously difficult to document, with victims often too afraid to speak up or are caught up in the midst of war. The few figures that do exist fail to present the sheer scale of abuse. The difficulty in documenting the crimes has ensured difficulty in prosecuting the criminals.
There will be trials at some stage, but you've got to separate what is effectively prosecutable now, where there is a jurisdiction to deal with that, those cases where you have to safeguard the evidence, and then the third issue is actually dealing with the accountability of UN agencies themselves. But this requires a combined effort in eradicating rape and sexual violence in conflict and recognizing it as a weapon of war, because that's what it is.
A global summit was held with a message to bring people to justice and end impunity. Special Envoy for the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, actress Angelina Jolie, co-chaired the event.
As an international community, we are responsible for that. We need to shatter that culture of impunity and make justice the norm, not the exception, for these crimes. We need political will replicated across the world, and we need to treat this subject as a priority.
Delegations from 123 countries agreed on an action plan.
The difficulty is actually implementing some of those steps. And of course, there are, the ICC in particular has approached this as a particular problem that needs to be addressed. Regrettably, it doesn't have jurisdiction in certain states.
The former Yugoslavia presents one of the most infamous cases of the systematic use of sexual violence as a tool in conflict. It is estimated that 40,000 women were raped in the large-scale abuse of Bosnian Muslim women during the war. The impregnation of women, a tool to aid ethnic cleansing. The post-war period saw abuses continue.
You've been hired to represent the U.S. as a beacon of hope.
Award-winning film The Whistleblower retells the story of former UN officer Catherine Bolkovac, who went to Bosnia as a part of a United Nations mission in 1999. During her trip, she uncovered the organized trafficking of young women who were kidnapped, tortured and raped.
What's going on here?
I don't know.
I found it really hard to believe that my colleagues and internationals from across the world who were there as members of the United Nations and there to assist and help in the rebuilding of these type of situations after you've had a war in your country, were actually of the mindset that this was okay, that this was something that was natural, that it was kind of a boys will be boys club in an organization that was supposed to have such high esteem and credibility as the United Nations. The better job of vetting and a better job of accountability and oversight wasn't being done.
She reported that even UN personnel were found to be partaking in the abuse. Following her revelations, She was subsequently fired. Catherine was working for DynCorp, a private contractor providing American personnel for the UN mission. She later sued the organisation, winning her case at a British court. DynCorp continued to win multi-million-dollar military contracts with the American government in Iraq, Afghanistan and Haiti, among others. UN officers are protected by diplomatic immunity, meaning they can't be prosecuted in their mission country. But even those who can be prosecuted rarely face the prospect of being brought into a court.
You also have to ensure that there is a process which is transparent, but also recognises the interests of those that are accused of very serious crimes, so that it is a credible process, recognising the fair trial interests of those who have been accused. So it's not just a matter of naming and shaming. I mean, it has to be a proper legal process. The difficulty when their own peacekeepers are responsible for human rights violations need to be dealt with not only from those that are committing crimes in conflict zones, which they are policing, but they often come from countries that don't have a particularly great human rights record themselves.
Despite the historic abuses, recent wars in Syria, Iraq and the Central African Republic have led to the UN saying that sexual violence in conflicts has reached a new juncture.
We still need to do a lot more. So we need to be making sure that impunity for these crimes is stopped, and that people at all levels, not only senior commanders, but at all levels, are held accountable for sexual violence in conflict. We also need to be looking, I think, in a more broad way at what contributes to sexual violence, both in conflict and outside of conflict. And a lot of that does have to do, of course, with gender stereotypes, power dynamics, and inequality. And I think, if we can help continue to address those issues, then hopefully at some point, rape as a weapon of war will not be condoned. It will not be seen as a really acceptable form of violence.
There's little hope of justice for Habiba or the tens of thousands of others who have come forward with their abuse. Their shared stories and the highlighting of their plight has had little impact on the fight to end the use of sexual violence as a weapon of war. Yasmin Khatoon Diwan, reporting for Insight.
Well, to discuss that further, I'm joined now by Britta Fernandez-Schmidt, who is the Executive Director of Women for Women International, a charity that has helped almost 500,000 marginalised women in countries affected by war and conflict. Why do you think this phenomenon of rape used in conflict is still so prevalent today?
What we see, Martin, in the countries where we work, where Women for Women International is operating, in countries like Congo, Afghanistan, is that actually the sexual violence is part of a much wider phenomenon of violence against women. And it's very much based on gender stereotypes, on an understanding that women are second-class citizens, that they're an extension of male property, and as such, women then get raped in order to actually beat the enemy, in order to destroy the social fabric because of the stigma that is attached to sexual violence and rape for the women.
So if it is endemic in some societies, it's a routine event in the home, however wrong we might think that is, it's asking a lot of soldiers or people caught up in a conflict to behave any differently then, isn't it?
I think it's a question of fundamental human rights. Women have the right to protection, and that is internationally agreed in various conventions. And the international community has an obligation to uphold those rights. And absolutely, we have to demand that soldiers stop raping. Rape is an issue that's not just an issue in countries affected by conflict. It is all over the world, and it is a fundamental human rights violation.
And is there any progress? This must be, I suspect, a frustrating area to work in. Have you seen any progress where behaviour of those caught up in conflict is improving?
Yeah, it's really important actually to flag that whilst we feel that probably the violence is increasing, maybe we just know more about it. Sexual violence has been used in conflicts, ever since we can remember, but we know more about it, and that's good because it needs to stop. And yes, improvements, we can see improvements. So Women for Women International, for example, so we work with women and help them rebuild their lives, but at the same time, we are also working with men, and we are raising their awareness. And we work with military leaders in Congo, with religious leaders in Afghanistan, and we talk to them about the importance of women's rights and women's empowerment. And actually, often men are also trapped in those gender stereotypes. And when we give them the opportunity...
Sort of expected behaviour.
Absolutely, exactly. And when we give them the opportunity to realize that it doesn't say anywhere that you have to beat your wife or that it's okay to use rape as a weapon in war, and instead we talk about alternative ways of behaving, we are also actually giving men alternatives. And actually, I remember one man actually said to me, as a result of the training that he had received, he said, you know, I will now not marry my daughter at the age of 12 in Afghanistan, which is very common and immediately restricts the possibilities for women's lives. Instead, I will wait until she finishes school. And so, you know, progress is...
I was going to ask you about that, because one of the phenomenons in the wider consideration of men behaviours to women is that it is still commonplace in many parts of the world that what most parts of the world regard as children, under 18s, are married off. And they endure not, if you like, not normal sexual relations in marriage, but often abusive or violent relationships.
Yeah. And you know, you're not supposed to be married off at 12, and you're not supposed to have children, you know, before the age of 18. So, so it goes back to the point that I was making. It is absolutely about education and awareness raising, and it is possible, but it needs to be done in a very sensitive manner that understands the community dynamics and that is based on ensuring that the community prospers. And our message at Women for Women International is that if you invest in women, you invest in the community. The ripple effects will benefit everyone.
And in terms of empowering women to say no, or to refuse, or to fight back in some way, are they not able to do that because it's often done at the threat of death?
Yes, it is done at the threat of death. And so what we have found is that bringing women together and giving them the confidence and telling them that actually their rights are enshrined internationally, which many women we work with don't know about. But once we do that, they literally, you can see them standing up and they feel supported by their sisters, as it were, and they challenge it. And I have seen a recent, actually for the first time, rape has been convicted as a weapon in war. In Rwanda, there was a case of the Rwandan mayor Akayesu, and 3 brave women who had been raped stood up and they testified, and their lives were threatened. And I think we need to celebrate the bravery and resilience of women who are brave enough to stand up.
Well, that's all well and good, but are they still okay?
They are
okay. Do you think there will be
okay.
repercussions? Will they live in fear of their lives forevermore because they did that?
No, I don't think they will. The case is very public now. A film has been made about it called The Uncondemned. We had the premiere screening just a few weeks ago, and the women attended some of the screenings. They are strong. They are very public now and public figures, and their lives are safe. But there are many women's lives who are not safe, and we need to protect them.
But that must be the big challenge, to try and get a conviction by finding the guilty party or parties and bringing them to face some kind of whatever correct in that territory, you know, a trial, a court, whatever it might be. That's a challenge, because how are you going to identify who did it?
Yeah. It's a huge fact. I mean, identifying who did it is actually not difficult, because once you get the trust of the women, they will tell you. They will tell you, this neighbor raped me and this neighbor. And it's about then taking the next step and having teams that are brave enough and are resilient enough and, you know, are going to see it through, because you will have faced so many obstacles. And the Uncondemned actually tells that story very powerfully. But the biggest challenge is providing support to women who testify and ensuring that they're not victimized all over again.
Okay, Britta, thank you very much for being with us today. This is Insight. Coming up, how men are affected by sexual violence in conflict zones too.